Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I believe you have over around 300 people right now, and people are still coming. So sorry for waiting for a couple of minutes. So I'm Karaman Hassan. I'm a research scholar at the University of Houston Law Center. As usual, as a part of Environmental Energy and Natural Resource Center at the University of Houston Law Center, we have a webinar series, and each month we invite a distinguished scholar to talk about timely topic. So today I'm moderating the webinar with my colleague and our co-director of the ENA Center, Professor Tracy Hester. And we are so honored and pleased to welcome Professor Michael Livermore. He's a professor of the University of Virginia School of Law, and he is talking about very interesting topic. And I believe that the large number that are joining us prove that we have a very interesting topic. So it's hard to know, like, introduce someone which is well known like Professor Livermore, but I appreciate and I really thank you for your time to discuss on this topic. So Professor Livermore is well known for his legal analysis and widely interdisciplinary topics, including technology, empirical analysis, and public policy. And he's well known for his books on cost-benefit analysis, which most of them, I believe, published by Oxford University. And beyond his area, his scholarship helped shape contemporary conversation on how AI models and computational tools emerging technology can transfer legal reasoning, regulatory analysis, and legal institutions. So Professor Livermore earns his JD at the University of New York University Law School, and he was a foreign scholar, and also he was a managing editor for the Law Review. So in addition, his influential academic work, Professor Livermore has been forefront of examining how intellectual, like intelligence, is changing the legal profession and legal scholarship. And his leadership in this area, and particularly, he's a director of the LawTech Center at the University of Virginia University. He's also contributed significantly to discussion about the opportunities and risks associated with AI-driven legal analysis. And in today's webinar, he's talking about this very interesting topic, which is legal language models in a legal analysis, which comes at a particularly very important and timely uh, topic, which all of us know that LLM are rapidly shaping how lawyers draft, analyze, and legal materials, and also not only affecting lawyers, like this affecting all the legal education courses as well as legal firms. And so, Professor Livermore, thank you so much again for this opportunity. Thank you so much for being with us for such very interesting topic. So, as usual, our distinguished speaker talk about 35 minutes to 40 minutes, and after then we have a Q&A discussion, and I will make sure to share with you the CLE credit at the end of the talk. But meanwhile, if you have any question, please feel free to type in on the Q&A box. And now, please, Professor Livermore, the floor is yours, and thanks so much for accepting our invitation again.
Great. Yes, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to the conversation. This will be is obviously a very Interesting topic, and one that I've been working in this area for a while now. So, what I will be talking about today are, at some level, it's a slightly higher level of abstraction, thinking about the way that large language models kind of affect um, our ability to do legal research. Is really how I got into this topic, but this speaks more broadly to the question of large language models in legal institutions. But today I'm going to be speaking kind of somewhat more conceptually, but I'm happy in the Q&A to discuss more practical questions. There's a lot of very deep practicalities about how to integrate these models into the workflow of law. And I teach a course at the University of Virginia called LawTech, which is really about this question of how technologies, including large language models, but other types of computational technologies, are affecting legal practice and what the kind of frontier and what the future looks like in that regard as well. So I'm happy to discuss that more generally. I also focus in my substantive work on environmental law, where there's obviously an intersection as well. So I'm happy to chat about that intersection if folks are interested in the Q&A. But just to kind of get us started, so um, the way that I think about the current technological moment is in a broader context. Large language models are not the first technology that has affected legal practice, far from it. In fact, legal practice and legal institutions, how we do law, has always been deeply conditioned by technology, and in particular by information technology. And so, just going back to Hammurabi's code, which was, at the dawn of writing, well, writing is an information technology. And so, right from the very beginning, where we have, the first real information technology, which was writing, or at least an extremely profound technological change, we see an effect on how we manage norms. And that's the birth of law as a written enterprise. And at each stage, if we think about the printing press, changed how legal institutions work. The technology of a library, the Justinian Code, which was a kind of technology that compiled the laws that were kind of in use during the Byzantine period. All of these are technologies that affected the law. Now, more recently, things like the West Reporter system, compiling the cases in the West Reporter system, the bibliographic indexing technology that was introduced by West and that got kind of gradually updated over the years. These affected legal practice. Even more recently, the digitization of legal texts, the use of commercial databases like Westlaw and Nexus, the improvement of search technologies on those platforms, all of these things affected um, how law works, really, how legal institutions work, how legal practice operates. So I do think of these recent advances within the broader scope of that technological history. So to consider the particular special contribution of large language models, the analog that I place it to is really what they are is an improvement, a radical improvement, but nevertheless not kind of out of no context. But they're an improvement to what we could call natural language processing technologies, NLP. So NLP is a field of machine learning within the broader field of systems engineering and computer science that's focused on computational approaches to analyzing and producing natural language, where natural language is just how you and I talk with each other, as opposed to like a formal language of some kind. And so, what earlier NLP methods that were used by some legal scholars and had some implications for legal practice, although mostly behind the scenes. So, what we had there were things like a bag of words models. So, bag of words models take a text, in our case, a legal text, and then just count the words. Now, this might actually, like how many times the word the appears, how many times the word constitution appears, how many times the word tort appears, or whatever within a document. It's a way of summarizing a document, basically, in a machine understandable way. And bag of words models are actually very powerful, and you actually can do a lot with them. And those kinds of models, for example, sit behind a search function in a commercial database. And you could do various kinds of legal scholarship based on data bag of words models and new technologies that were built on bag of words models include things like topic models. So a topic model is a statistical tool to take a large collection of documents and surface the topics within those documents. Within law, you can kind of think of the topics as having an analog with like the keynote in Westlaw, right? So kind of what is the case about? And so you could do things like look at how the docket of the U.S. Supreme Court has shifted over time. That's like one example of a study that you could do with a topic model. But there were various kinds of limitations in these earlier methods. It requires a lot of what's called pre-processing, or in machine learning, they refer to feature engineering, which means that the engineer, the person who's doing the data analysis, has to kind of know what they're looking for and then figure out how to construct a representation of that mathematically or statistically. It's going to always be not perfect. You've got a lot of bespoke training data sets where you're hand labeling all kinds of information. And then obviously with anything with a bag of words is you're missing out on a lot of context, syntax, and meaning. So it's a very lossy representation of the data. Okay, so that's kind of the old school method. A lot of interesting work got done that way, and a lot of tools were actually developed that had practical significance. But what large language models is they really transform how you are going to interact with documents through a computational format. So one is large language models allow you to interact with the legal text directly. You're not translating the text into some very strange representation like a bag of words. Instead, of course, there are transformations happening in the background within the large language models, but in terms of the user interface, you're working with a text. Now, there is a machinery there. There is an engine where you're sending, information back and forth to the model, and the model, of course, is internally representing the text in a mathematical fashion. And it is somewhat useful to know how that works, but that is nevertheless from a user's perspective, there is this fluency where you're just interacting with natural language. So that's one. Second major difference is that what you're doing in terms of engineering is really on the front end, and it's done by the engineers of the large language model itself, rather than on like a per task basis. So what, Claude or OpenAI or whoever, Meta for an open source model, they produce a model that they release to the public. This is a highly engineered artifact. And then as a user, again, you don't have to do any of this engineering. You're just a user of this model that's meant to be very all purpose, as opposed to trying to construct something on a task by task basis. Another thing about large language models is that they're general representations that transfer across tasks. So for people who have used them, you know that you can do many different kinds of things with an all-purpose large language model. You can analyze the sentiment in a document. You can do translation with a large language model between different languages. You can identify, you can do grammar checking with a large language model. There's a lot of things that you can do with a large language model as opposed to, so it's an all-purpose tool as opposed to a toolkit, which is very, there's pros and cons to that, but that is the nature of the thing. And then finally, for different kinds of research, on the one hand, the old tools would give you kind of a mathematical statistical information about texts, which can be useful, actually, can be very, very useful for understanding the thing that you want to understand, but requires some expertise and some delicacy with interpreting what's going on. Whereas the large language model outputs directly into natural language that you can just interpret. It's right there. It's in English. You can just read it. Now, then again, that has pros and cons. When you have a mathematical output that requires interpretation, well, it's clear that it requires interpretation. It's not kind of just right there on its face. You have to do something with this information, and that forces you to be careful in that interpretation. If it kind of it forces a certain mindset of care, whereas large language models just produce this text that is very easy to understand. It's in English. It's kind of almost interprets. It's almost self-interpreting, but this can actually lead us to let our guard down a little bit, lead us to kind of accept the model outputs as natural and meaningful automatically, whereas actually probably we would be better served if we were doing a little bit more interpretation, to being, I don't know if skeptical is the right word, but applying a certain critical lens to the outputs that we're getting from the model. Okay, so that's so those are some relevant differences. But the kind of key takeaway here is that methods that were fairly confined to a small group of legal scholars or technologists, these computational approaches to studying and understanding legal texts, have been opened up to the world. And now many people, anyone who has access to large language models, has some kind of ability to do computational analysis of legal texts, either for scholarship or for practical reasons. Okay, so within the world of legal scholarship, I'll talk about how large language models are having an important effect. But all of these have analogs in practice as well, and so we can think about that as well. All right. So one way that you can use a large language model to carry out legal scholarship is through one here, feature extraction and data generation. So what you do is you have an unstructured collection of text. And unstructured just means it's just the words, it's just the documents. They haven't been translated into any quantitative representation that can be subject to statistical analysis. You just have just the documents that we're familiar with in law. But what you can do with a large language model is you can very quickly and automatically translate those documents into data that can be analyzed. So say you are interested in trends in bankruptcy courts, for example, in the United States. Well, you start with just the bankruptcy decisions, okay, or maybe even transcripts, whatever you have, just the data that you have. And you are interested in, whether, some particular argument in bankruptcy is becoming more common or becoming less common, what kinds of parties are introducing these kinds of arguments. Are bankruptcy judges amenable to these arguments or non-amenable to the arguments? That's what you're interested in, okay? Well, again, with the raw text, you have, some thousands of text. It'd be very hard to know what's going on. Are there trends? Are there regional trends? Are there trends in the parties? Are there temporal trends or whatever? But in principle, with a little bit of work, you can use a large language model to extract that information very easily. So, for example, you just have an argument in bankruptcy, well, and whatever argument that you're interested in, and then you can just run the documents, say the decisions, through a large language model, where the large language model outputs for every decision whether that argument is present or not. And also whether it's accepted, for example. So the large language model goes case by case by case by case. And for case one, tells you whether the argument's present or not. For case two, tells you whether the argument is present or not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And does this for your thousands of cases. And then you can do some analysis. You can look at time changes. You can look regionally. You can look at the party of the appointing president for the judge or whatever, the background of the judge. Whatever you're interested in, and you can look for relationships between this feature, right, whether this argument was present or not, and other things that you might be interested in. And you could do this for scholarly reasons because you want to know what's going on in the courts, or you might do it for practical reasons because you want to know what kind of arguments to make to who, when, and under what circumstances. Okay, so that's one kind of task that you can do, an area, okay, is feature extraction data generation. The second one would be kind of prediction, classification, or description. So let's say, for example, what would this mean? You want to forecast the outcome of cases, right? Now, what would that mean? Well, again, you have a couple different options here. So one possibility, for example, is you want to know how our jury's going to respond to some kind of argument. Okay, you want to know this, and you could, of course, survey people. That would be a perfectly good, you get a focus group or something like this. But now you can do this crazy thing where you can use the large language model as essentially a proxy for how a human being would respond to certain kinds of arguments. So you just say, imagine you have this profile. You go into the large language model, you imagine you have this profile. You're this age group, you this from this region, you have these political views or whatever. And you are now viewing this document or viewing this argument or whatever. What is and you have to make a decision. What kind of decision are you going to make? Okay, so almost as a proxy for how human beings would respond to a certain kind of input. You could do the same thing with judges. So it's almost like people have talked about in other areas of software engineering, the idea of digital twins, where you kind of construct a virtual representation of it could be a person, it could be a city, it could be whatever decision-making entity you're interested in, or thing that you want to model. And so you could use large language models in this kind of fashion. Okay. Again, you have to be very careful in how you do this. Okay, but it's something that you could contemplate. And again, you could do this for scholarly reasons or for practical reasons. Kind of related here is that you can use large language models to measure the meaning of words or contract terms or statutes. So there's a couple of different ways that this could be done. So one is simply in asking the large language model, right, to generate text, because that's always what you're doing when you ping a large language model. You're always just essentially um, uh, providing it with a prompt that it's responding to, and it's always just generating text for you. That's what it is. These large language models are text generating machines. Okay, and so what you're doing is say, if you're interested in measuring the meaning of words, you can just prompt the model with questions regarding the meaning of words and get you answers. And those answers are the result of the very large amount of training data that was used to create the model. And so you're getting a certain kind of very averaged response to your prompts. So that's one possibility. Another that's a little bit more sophisticated requires that you kind of go under the hood of the models a little bit. And there are computational ways that you could go under the hood of large language models to see how words are being represented within the model. And you could see how that those representations do or do not match up with, maybe say your intuitive understanding of what the word is and so on. Okay, so there are these kind of prediction, classification, description types of operations that you could perform with the large language model. And again, you can do this for scholarly reasons or practical reasons. Now, a final kind of research that's being done on large language models and the law is almost like a new kind of scholarship that's within the domain of engineering and benchmarking. So what is this? Again, this is very relevant for practice, but it's also kind of a purely scholarly enterprise as well. And so the idea is in the history of machine learning, a major way that progress was made in certain domains was to establish a benchmark of some kind. Okay, so an example is in the field of machine vision. And so we're trying to, the computer scientists and machine learning people were trying to improve how machine vision worked. And in particular, whether machines could take an image and then could classify what that image did or did not include. So, for example, you can make a data set where you have lots of images of animals and you have labeled versions that say some of these are cats, some of these are dogs, some of these are alligators, some of these are birds. And so that's your data set, and you're going to try to train the model to distinguish the cats from the dogs, from the alligators, from the birds. And the benchmark is a standard data set like this that you then, the community of researchers and people in technology can construct models to see if they can improve their performance against the benchmark. Okay, so this process of having a benchmark and trying to improve performance against the benchmark has led to massive gains in many different areas of machine learning, including the development of large language models. And you may even see, if you follow this debate or just kind of this discourse on large language models, when a new large language model comes out, there will be a conversation about how well that large language model performs on certain benchmarks. And the benchmarks can be coding tasks, or it could be understanding or healthcare related tasks or whatever. So this is something that you'll see in descriptions when new large language models come out. Well, within the legal domain, there's been an effort to construct benchmarks for the performance of large language models at legal tasks. Okay, so the most obvious benchmark that got used quite quickly in the context of large language models was the bar exam, the multi-state bar exam, and there were kind of news reports about how ChatGPT was taking the bar and was outperforming students or whatever else. And what that is that's a benchmark. That's a way of assessing the performance of large language models at least a certain kind of law-related task, which is answering questions in the bar exam. Now, we all know that answering questions on the bar exam is not what lawyers do all the time. And thank goodness. And so instead, we need more sophisticated benchmarks that better capture a fuller range, a more realistic picture of what legal work is like, as a way of one, assessing the performance of large language models, and then two, improving the large language models against these benchmarks. Okay, so that's an entire field of scholarship that's focused in this within law, the intersection of law and technology, on developing benchmarks and then improving the performance of certain kinds of models against these benchmarks, because there's different ways that you can design or tune or tweak the models to improve their performance on these benchmarks. Okay, so that's a domain of scholarship that's very important in this area. Okay, so yeah, so this is just a little site to examine that a little bit further, the first application of generating structured text from data from legal text. Again, you can do the direct large language model classification, where, just as example, this one paper, Frankenreiter and Talley, where they're looking for officer protection waivers in corporate documents. Okay, so you just go through every corporate document that you're interested in, and you can see what kinds of officer protection waivers there are, and the large language model is doing the classification. Another approach that was the embeddings in supervised learning. What you have here for an example is this Thalken and Stiglitz paper, where they look at modes of legal reasoning on the U.S. Supreme Court over the 20th century, basically, most importantly, over the 20th century, and they go under the hood, essentially, of the large language model, and they get a certain kinds of outputs from the large language model that are not just kind of like what the large language model says, but also more mathematical representations. And then they use that to train a classification model, where they looked at different styles of legal reasoning, and then they examine how those styles of legal reasoning gain or fall in prominence on the U.S. Supreme Court over a 100-year period. And so those are like these two kinds of ways of using large language models to extract data from legal texts. Either, again, simply asking the model as if it was a person, or taking quantitative data from the model and doing, say, using that to inform a machine learning model. Okay. Again, what can we do here in the second application of prediction, classification, description? So I'll give a couple examples here. So one, this paper, Nyarko and Sangha, they use large language models, they use quantitative outputs from a large language model, what's called an embedding, that looks at the meaning of words and how the meaning of words relate to each other, and they compare that measure for terms that appear both in legal texts and amongst regular people walking around in the street. And so they see, for example, how a term like reasonable or consent takes on a very special and specific meaning in law versus amongst lay users of the English language. And so this is quite interesting. You can examine these terms, um, which terms really are the ones that have the most specialized meaning versus the most kind of common sense meaning. Another paper by John Choi, this is the last one on statutory clarity, develops a quantitative measure, again, using a component of a large language model to examine which texts, say in statutory language, which terms are uncertain versus are clear, right? And he develops a measure of statutory clarity that you in principle could inform even judicial deliberations over, when you're interpreting a statutory text, for example. Okay, so those are some applications, and then for the engineering and benchmarking, I'll just mention a couple of the benchmarks. Legal Bench is a paper I worked on a little bit where there's 162 tasks across several different areas of legal reasoning, and then you take the large language model and you see how well it performs at these set of tasks to determine, it's overall, it's a benchmark. You're seeing how well it does at kind of certain subset of legally relevant tasks. And there are several other competing benchmarks. You have a large LexEval is a major data set of Chinese legal questions. And so these benchmarks are a way of coming to understand how well these models do or do not perform. And that's a key thing because the models, even though they're quite powerful, underperform in some important ways. So I'll talk about those quickly and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So one problem that many people have heard of is the hallucination problem. And what is that? Well, we know that these models tend to fabricate information, right? It's just a well-known thing. We've likely all heard about it. Fabricated cases. We know that that some law firms have gotten in trouble for submitting briefs to courts where they include AI hallucinations, which primarily include fake cases that don't exist. And in research on this question of hallucination, we find quite substantial amounts of hallucination still. In the 50s to 80% for the commercial models. Not every citation that doesn't mean that in 60% of cases the citation's wrong, but in 60% of, say, prompts, there will be some hallucination or responses. And this is true even for the commercial AI tools. With what's called retrieval augmented generation, where the tools use their law search and functions to go collect the relevant law and then use that relevant law to inform the responses that the models provide. But even with that fairly sophisticated approach, there's still a substantial amount of hallucination that's happening. Okay, so this is something we're all kind of aware of, but even though you do see improvements, it remains a major issue and really a major limitation in widespread adoption of these models, at least for certain kinds of applications. Okay, so what are the biggest structural changes going forward for the use of large language models in legal practice or legal scholarship? So one is this idea of a jagged frontier, is that the models are very good at some things and then they fail sometimes, and they fail in very unpredictable ways. So they kind of lull you into a false sense that they're very high performers. and we don't know the failure modes. We're very bad at predicting when the models are going to fail. This is a major issue because if you knew when the model works and when a model fails, then you just use it when it's going to work and you avoid it when it's going to fail. But that's not the current situation. Um, the models are very bad at addressing legal change because they're trained on prior data, so they're not very good at keep. It's very hard for them to stay updated. There's concerns about bias and fairness, of course, because they've been trained on existing data, which has biases in it. And there are some very important questions around competence and confidentiality and so on that anyone working with these models has to be aware of. Okay, just final words. So what does this mean? Generally for legal practice is that large language models are in no way oracles. They're good for summarization, drafting support, but they're very bad at just telling you facts about the world in a reliable fashion. It's good to match the tools to the task. Um, where models are doing something more like summarization, it's going to be much more reliable than if you're just asking it general questions. You want to benchmark your model, so it's very you want to see for a commercial product, for example, how that model is performing against well-established public benchmarks, and not just there's some pretty outlandish claims out there about the performance of these models. And then the final point, which is again very important, is to build validation into the workflow for whatever task you're turning over or any task that a large language model is performing. You want to have some ground truth, which is probably a human version that you can compare to the model, at least in a subset of cases, to detect or just to estimate how well the model is performing compared to, say, a human being, so that you know that it's valid, and you just want to continually incorporate some kind of validation procedure into the use of these models. And again, this is true both for practitioners and for scholars. Okay, that's it for my little talk, and look forward to Q&A.
Excellent. Carmen, should I jump in now or would you like to?
Yes, Tracy. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. And just a belated brief introduction. I'm Tracy Hester, professor here at the University of Houston Law Center with Carmen in the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center, and an AI crash test dummy myself. So I'm always happy to talk about this topic. So first, to remind everybody, the chat is available for questions. We have nearly 300 people online today, so I imagine there is a wellstorm of potential questions and interest out there. Please don't be shy and jump in. We'll curate and get them as best as we can. To kick things off, I guess, as you might expect, I could probably keep you for 3 hours just myself. So I guess question number one, I know that the question I get most often about AI is about the hallucination concerns. Um, yeah, we find ourselves hearing horror stories repeatedly about briefs being submitted to courts which have hallucinations in them. And you've pointed out that it is an issue that needs to have benchmarking to squarely address. But I'm just taking it theoretically. I've also seen workarounds where some of the LLMs have incorporated the ability to use basically a programming hook to access Westlaw or Bloomberg and check the citations that they have put into a document and theoretically weed out a lot of the hallucinations. So the question I have is the hallucination actually, as I've been told by some folks, a theoretical, absolute, irreducible risk of these programs that can never be weeded out? Or is it something that can actually be reduced to a level that makes these potential uses of LLMs less potentially worrisome?
Great. So, what I would say is depends a little bit on how we define a hallucination. Okay. And so, because I've heard some experts in the domain of large language models say everything a large language model does is a hallucination. It's hallucinating all the time, right? And so that's, because it doesn't know anything about the world. It's just generating text, and that text sometimes maps onto the world in meaningful ways and sometimes doesn't. The model has no idea that it doesn't separate truth from reality. There's no notion of truth. It's just generating text. Okay. So that's like one extreme version of the view, which is that everything the model does is hallucinate all the time. Okay. That would be a very broad understanding of what a hallucination is. On the other hand, um, in law, we might have a very specific definition of of a hallucination, which would be, for example, including a citation to a case that does not exist. Right? Now, if the definition is very narrow like that, then you're right. It's actually trivial to test whether there are hallucinations in a document because you just go through and you can do this in an automated fashion. You just go through the document, you identify every case in the document that is cited, and you plug that information into a search bar on Westlaw, and you see whether the case exists. And as long as the case exists, you could say no hallucination. Now, the problem is that's probably too narrow of a definition of what hallucination is. For example, even if that citation exists, but it discusses a case that has nothing to do with the brief where it appears, or it is, in the brief it is cited for a legal proposition that appears nowhere in that case. We would probably say that's also a hallucination. It's not just that the document exists or not, but also that it is correctly cited and stands for the proposition and so on and so forth. And that is more complex. That is harder, much harder to trace down. That is not just a matter of plug and play into Westlaw to see whether the citation exists. Then you need to pull that original document and then have some kind of assessment of whether the citation or the use of that document is accurate or not. Now, again, that can be done for sure. It can be done, but you have to get benchmarks. You have to have standards. Like we probably disagree to some extent about whether a case is accurately characterized in a brief, and so it's a much more complex question once you move beyond just the question of whether the case exists or not.
Sure, but just a small follow-up then. Is it ultimately, though, a problem that's transitional that can be solved in the long run if we, for example, have LLMs do the semantic processing as well as the case
Mhm.
confirmation? Or is this just something that it's a ghost in the machine we aren't going to be able to exercise?
Again, it just depends a little bit on how we define the problem, right?
Fair enough.
And so if what so yeah, so I then added, okay, does the case exist? So then we have an additional question, which is the, very specifically for the legal proposition for which the case is cited, is that an appropriate interpretation of the cited case? And you're right, you could use a large language model to answer that question or not, to answer that question. And I think there's probably less fear that it's going to hallucinate because it's got the case right in front of it. And you say, this is the legal proposition. This is the case. Is this appropriate? And you could train it and you could probably get it to perform at a fairly high level. Um, and so that I think would be solvable. So and that's, those are probably the most blatant examples of hallucinations. I think the more abstract idea, which is the model's always hallucinating in some sense, that it does not understand the world. It has no true model of the law. It's just producing text that reliably predicts what human beings would have generated in the same context. That I think is not solvable. That's just the nature of the models. And so if one thinks that that's inherently unsatisfying because there is no latent, model of the law, unlike us that have a model of the law in our minds, just because the machine doesn't work the same way that we do, then if that's unsatisfying, then you can't solve it.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I think Carmen was actually going to speak, but I interrupted him.
Oh, no, no. Just want to make sure that the CLE credit is available. I don't know, are you seeing the
Yep, I see it.
on the
Yep.
screen? Okay. And just one question, like a couple of colleagues asked me from our perspective. Is the time now that put some percentage of our evaluation for how to use AI and transparency and how to somehow prepare the students to use AI in the way, because I look to the data now, most of the law firms are somehow they use it and somehow some of them also training the lawyers. So is it time for the law schools to somehow put a percentage maybe in an evaluation to how they use AI, how somehow either encourage them or how you think the best approach to using AI in a legal academy and preparing students for that?
Yeah, it's a big set of questions. I mean, I think that for me, I think more about just teaching and what are we teaching them, right? So, and there are many different questions that come up in this context because they have to worry about are they using large language models to answer their exams and all, so they're worried about that, but at the same time, so I think I have a couple thoughts on this. So one is I do think it's important for law students to get exposure to these models in law school. Okay, I think that's important. And there is a certain tendency amongst some professors, which is not altogether wrong, it's quite understandable, which is that we worry that the students are going to use large language models and are not going to learn themselves how to write legal text, how to analyze, and how to do the things that we are teaching them how to do in law school. And we want them to learn how to do that stuff. We do not want them, using large language models in such a way that they never learn how to read a judicial opinion or write a legal memo. They have to learn how to do that stuff. And so if they're using large language models all the time, there's a worry in any case that we're not going to be able to teach effectively, and the students are never going to learn the basic skills of being a lawyer. On the other hand, so that's a worry, and so we have to limit the use of large language models to avoid that problem. On the other hand, if we prohibit the use of large language models for the entire course of students' careers, they're never going to learn how to use these things properly, and so they're going to get to law firms and they're going to be unprepared, and they're just not going to be able to take advantage of the great opportunities, the cost savings, the time savings that you can get out of these models, which are very important. And so I think that what we're going to see in the coming years is almost like a bifurcated system where on the one hand, we're going to have certain experiences in law school that are going to be, where no large language models are allowed. It's going to be kind of where there's no large language models allowed, and then we're going to have others where we're encouraging them to use large language models. I think it's important to teach them what these things are. A little bit of, it's not just a matter of like, hey, we're going to teach you how to use Claude 5.1, because that's going to become obsolete within a few years, right? We want to teach them more fundamentally what's going on with these models, how they work, how they, the math behind them, how they're likely to evolve over time, and so on and so forth, so that they can, they can be sophisticated consumers and maybe even develop some, developers in this space. It's a good question of how you evaluate that. We have traditional tools for evaluating students. I haven't thought a great deal about how you evaluate their fluency at large language models. I'm been thinking more about just how to give them exposure to the models in the first place.
Excellent. Carmen, is that the only question that we've had so far?
Yep, and
Great.
we have a question on Q&A if you have access.
Hold on one second. All right.
There we go.
Oh, here we go. It may be related to what you just said, Michael, but Josh Sharnoff, who is well known to all of us, hello, does ask the following. Given that AI searches and generates text much faster than humans, how much, if any, reliance should students be placing on the outputs for any work, given that they have not yet mastered the skills to evaluate legal text? So it sounds like to a certain extent, it's the same dichotomy you were just describing in terms of certain tasks that require a fluency and skill set and others that you need to keep separate.
Right. And I think that that's the key thing is to really think deeply about this. Like, what do we need to teach them to do for themselves, right? And to what level of fluency? I think it's important not to just default to, well, whatever we did 10 years ago, that's the right thing still, right? Like things may have changed. There may be some things that we don't need to focus on as much. There's some other things that we need to focus more on. My instinct is that until you learn how to write well, you're never going to be able to check the outputs of the models well. But actually, I don't know that for a fact. That's just an instinct. I mean, maybe we could experiment with some of this stuff and try to learn, some different teaching techniques. I mean, gradually. I wouldn't treat the entire incoming class as guinea pigs, but they are. I mean, the reality is they're always guinea pigs to a certain extent. But we have to, be responsible about that. But but yeah, it strikes me as it would be very surprising if someone could become a very fluent editor of large language models without themselves being able to write. And I mean, when I work with these things, they're constantly producing crapola, and then I need to edit it and fix it. And I know how to do that because, at least in principle, I know how to write. And I spent a lot of years writing. But yeah, so I think that we have to be very intentional about that. And that is, and that's just a challenge for law professors going forward.
Absolutely. I think honestly, in this sphere, we're all guinea pigs. So I did have one other question that's parallel to, but perhaps not directly on what you've discussed. And again, for everyone else, we still have a few minutes left to ask questions. I was curious about the fact that LLMs also contain the capacity to enable lawyers to code in a ways that they previously would have required a skill set we just didn't have. So, for example, certainly Claude Code, certainly OpenAI's Codex,
Mhm.
basically allow you to basically create bespoke programming, particular tasks that would have been impossible even just 6 months ago.
Yep.
Now, for example, I was teaching a class on statutory interpretation where the challenge was the students had to write a regulation to govern prediction markets. I just
Mhm.
basically coded using Claude a functioning live trading platform to let them do their own prediction market and then try and figure out how to regulate their own creation. It seems to me that opens a lot of doors for legal practice and for legal scholarship and for legal instruction that we've been so focused on LLMs as a text generating model, we haven't really picked up on the fact that there's a whole new toolkit as well that we have to figure out.
Yeah, super, it's very interesting. And yeah, like the as a coding assistant, this kind of vibe coding thing is really interesting. Um, you know, I think this is quite general, actually. It's not just in law, it's in many different domains. And trying to figure out how to take advantage of this is a very interesting, because my impression is to be good at this task, to be able to use Claude effectively in this way that you're describing to produce code in other programming languages like Python or R or HTML or Java or whatever, it's good to know something about the basics of programming, actually. And that someone who doesn't know anything about that is going to have a very hard time using Claude or some other large language model to do that. And so I think um, figuring out how to teach students in law, but also more broadly, how to take advantage of the power of these models to write in Python or R or other, that's actually a really interesting question because you're right, absolutely right. Um, Coding the barrier to entry to writing Python code has collapsed in the last 6 months, absolutely collapsed. And so you have all of the power of these other programming languages kind of at your fingertips, but 99.9% of people have absolutely no idea what to do with that power. And so teaching people what to do with that is, I think, a big, it's a big and very interesting, very interesting challenge for the coming
Yeah,
year.
it's a steep learning curve, but it just needs more and more examples of how it's worked successfully for people to
Right.
sort of internalize it. Uh,
Exactly. Examples and
Now, speaking of vibes, I can't resist one question that got posted to the Q&A from an anonymous participant. Uh, I'll read it just because I feel it. I've seen widespread adoption of legal AI tools as in-house counsel. The productivity multiplier is very real, but I'm starting to feel more like a prompt junkie than a lawyer. Is AI going to fundamentally change how we practice law?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on what we mean by fundamental. I th It will probably change, and it will change some people's roles more than others, and it's how it kind of works its way into the practice. Um, but it's interesting. I think that technology has probably changed what it means to be a lawyer many times over the course of being that there being lawyers. It used to be that your ability to memorize and just have a lot of stuff in your head was very important. And now you can, then looking things up in a book became possible, and because you had the reporters. being able to search through lots of different legal cases became important at some point when it wasn't in the past. Um, there, honestly, things like email and other technologies have changed how people interact with their clients. The BlackBerry was an important change. So there's been actually a lot of technological changes in how law is practiced, kind of forever, rapidly with IT in the last, 30 years. But yeah, I mean, so I think that in a way that um, if you walked into a legal practice in 1975 and you spent an hour watching what people, or the day watching what people do, and then you fast forwarded to 2000, you would say, "Wow, that's really different. What people are spending their time is really different here in 2000." And I think 2000 to 2025. Yeah, it's different, but it's not maybe not as radical. Although, and then from 2025 to 2050, we might be in another period where, fast forward, it will be a very substantial. So that's probably true. I think there will be lawyers though. I mean, I don't think that we have to, personally, I'm not so worried about a jobs apocalypse within the legal profession.
Yeah. And I will admit, no one is typing up their work on Selectrics with carbon copy paper and then, trying to figure out how to trace the shepherds through a hard copy, red
Exactly.
bound volume,
Right.
which I'm dating myself now. Um, so we have a one time, hopefully for one last question. I'm going to a little bit over, but this is the one I think I spend the most time thinking about. We've focused a lot with LLMs on how they make it more speedy and effective and efficient to do the suite of skills and tasks that lawyers currently do, and how
Mhm.
that changes the economic model and how it multiplies the sorts of things we can do and how it affects pro se litigants and how it affects ethical obligations. But I am also curious, and you've touched on some of these, that LLMs and other programs make it possible for it to do types of things that have been impossible
Mhm.
previously, questions we simply couldn't ask or pursue, fields of information that were simply just not processable. So I was just curious if you had to sort of pick one or two of something that's on the horizon that is just kind of a complete change from what we do currently. It's not just what we currently do more efficiently, but something different. Do you have a sense of what those might be?
Yeah, I mean, so within legal scholarship, I really think it is a question of scale, but it's the ability, say, to extract information from, tens of thousands of legal cases that you never could have before. You could read 10 cases, but you can't read 10, you can read 100 cases. You're not going to read 10,000 cases. And, in a very, very flexible fashion to pull out information that's just latent there and that is of interest for doctrinal reasons or economic reasons or whatever else, as you come to understand, in your study of the law and legal institutions. So that I think it is in a way something that we did before, but the scale really matters. And so that I think is big. On the practitioner side or in the legal institution side, and I think, we really are going to incorporate algorithms, including large language models, into the mechanisms of governance. We're really going to use them to make decisions, to improve the quality of judicial deliberations, to improve how disability determinations are made. Over time, the computational tools are going to get integrated just kind of very pervasively throughout government decision making. And again, this is a 25, 50-year process. This is not going to happen tomorrow. But I think at the end of it, the institutions of governance really do change in a qualitative fashion. It's not just, a little bit of difference here and there. The same with a little bit more tech. It really does change the nature of how people interact with law, with legal institutions, and with each other.
I can't wait to see how the APA is going to deal with algorithmic LLM rules.
Right,
So,
exactly. That
with
kind of stuff.
that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Carmen, do you have any final comments or information you want to pass to the audience?
Yeah, just want to share with the audience. Professor Livermore, thank you so much for this outstanding talk. And for our next speakers, both Professor Alexandria Klaas and Professor Dave Owen, and they are talking about future of electricity and how we use innovation to meet the growing demand. So make sure to register and check our website, in our website, which is on June 1st. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Michael, thank you again. This has been a wonderful talk. And for everybody else, have a wonderful summer ahead. We'll see you again at the next one.
Thanks very much. Take
Thank
care.
you.